Hey guys, Roger here, and I've put together a budget gaming PC in the very smart looking Aero 1 case from AeroCool. Now the entire build cost just under £700 or $870, and I'll leave the details of all the parts I've used in this build in the description below. Now you could build this entire system for even less by changing a few of the parts I've actually used, but I'll talk about that a bit more towards the end of this video. I really like the look of the Aero 1 case, and the fans look awesome as the only part that lights up is the ring around the outside of each fan. And there are other small details I like about the case as well, such as the carbon fibre design at the front. That gives the case a little bit of character, I think, and it's a clean look too. So today's build is a simple one. There's nothing really crazy about this, and the idea was just to put it together on a fairly tight budget. But I did want to build something that was good enough for a decent gaming experience. Don't forget though, this definitely isn't the latest and greatest in terms of hardware, it's simply a decent PC on a budget. So as far as parts are concerned, in this build I'm using the ASRock B450 Steel Legend motherboard, which is a great board. It's been around for a while and it's still quite popular. It also has built-in RGB, so if RGB is something you want from a motherboard on a budget, well, this has it. It's compatible with the new Ryzen 3000 series chips as well, so if you decided to go with this motherboard, after making sure the BIOS is up to date, then you'd be able to stick a newer CPU in there at some point in the future without hardly any work at all. The processor I went with is AMD's Ryzen 5 2600, as you can pick these up at a fairly good price now. Now, it did come with the stock CPU cooler, but instead of that, I'm actually using the Cylon 4, which is also from AeroCool. It's really easy to install this, and the design matches up perfectly with the fans already in the Aero 1 case. Now this has 4 thermal heat pipes and a 120mm fan. On the back of the cooler you can see the fins that help to keep temperatures down, and there are 2 connectors, a 4-pin PWM connector and the all-important ARGB cable, which hooks up nicely to the RGB control hub that comes supplied with the Aero 1 case, which quite simply means you can sync up the RGB of this CPU cooler with the rest of the products in the case. The graphics card is the Zotac GTX 1650 Super GDDR6, as again, at the moment you can pick them up at such a good price. Now if you consider the level of performance you can get from this GPU, for the money it's a really good option in my opinion. The card is actually quite small, but I think it fits this build really well. From Kingston I'm using the legendary HyperX Fury RGB RAM. I really like these sticks of RAM. This is 2 8GB sticks of 2666 MHz DDR4 RAM, so 16GB in total. And also from Kingston is their A2500GB M.2 SSD with really nice read and write speeds. It can read up to 2200 meg per second, and it can write at up to 2000 meg per second, which really is super fast. It also uses less power and doesn't get as hot as a traditional SSD drive. This is the 500GB version, and you really do get a lot for your money with this. There are no other drives going into this build, which keeps it nice and simple, but you could obviously add more drives if you need a little bit of extra storage. So back to AeroCool, and they also make some great power supplies. And in this build I'm using the Cylon 700 watt, which is a semi-modular power supply. So I think where possible, a modular or semi-modular power supply always works out best, especially if you're trying to keep cables as tidy as possible inside the case. The focus of this build though is the Aero 1 case, and I do personally like the look of it. I think that's because of the RGB on the fans at the front. The thin line that lights up around each fan looks awesome. Now around the front panel you can see the carbon fibre detailing, which I think gives the case a nice clean look. The front panel has a metal mesh design which will allow for a good amount of airflow. There is also a magnetic dust filter on the inside of that front panel too. And while we're talking about dust filters, there's a magnetic one at the top and a removable one on the bottom. One side of the case has a tempered glass panel. It's really nice to see that, especially in a cheaper case, rather than clear acrylic. And you can see that there are 2 sections. The area at the top, of course, is where the motherboard will sit, and you have that separate area at the bottom for the power supply and the hard drive cage. There is space at the front for 3 120mm or 240mm fans, 220mm fans at the top, and a single 120mm fan at the back. And at the bottom there is enough room for another 2 120mm fans that will sit just below the graphics card. In this build I used 2 of AeroCool's Duo 12 Pro fans at the top of the case. They light up more than the other fans that come with the case, and so I thought adding these at the top would light up the inside of the case a little bit more, and I think they look pretty cool. If you plan to use a radiator in this case, the front has space for a 120, 240 or 360mm radiator, 120 or 240mm at the top, and 120mm at the back. And there's space for CPU coolers up to 161mm and graphics cards up to 327mm. The cage at the bottom can hold either 2 3.5-inch drives or one 2.5-inch SSD and one 3.5-inch hard drive. But there is also room for another 2 SSDs on that back panel. Taking a quick look at the top of the case, there are 2 USB 3.0 ports, the 3.5mm headphone and mic sockets, the LED control button, and the power button. So if you're interested in benchmarks, I did run a few just to see how this system would perform. I ran the Heaven benchmark, which reported an average frames per second count of 192.1 and a score of 4,839, and maximum temperatures of 70 degrees Celsius. I also ran Cinebench and the score there was 1,236 with a maximum temperature of 53 degrees Celsius, so really not bad. One of the games I just cannot stop playing, even now, is Fortnite. I know that some of you will be screaming at me right now, but I just cannot help it. So I played that for a bit and I found that with epic settings, I was getting around 90 frames per second, that's at 1080p. With high settings, I was getting 120 frames per second. And with medium settings, I was easily getting between 230 and 240 frames per second most of the time. So all fairly good for this budget system. If you want to build something similar to this, but your budget is just a bit lower, by changing a few of the parts I used, you could cut the cost a bit more. For example, if you went with non-RGB RAM and a lower capacity standard SSD, rather than the 500 gig M.2 that I've used in this build, you would easily be able to save around £60 or $75. And you could also look at second-hand graphics cards, which means you could potentially build this entire system for perhaps around £550 or $685. So a big thanks to AeroCool for supplying the Aero 1 case, which I think is absolutely gorgeous, the Cylon GPU cooler and the Duo 12 Pro fans for this build, and thanks also to Kingston for supplying the awesome A2000 M.2 SSD, which really is very good, and I'm sure that's going to make its way into plenty of builds I do in the future. Details for all of the parts used in this build are in the description below, so do feel free to go and take a look at those. And if you want to know more about any of the parts in this video, do drop me a comment below as well. If you enjoyed the video or you found it useful, please give it a thumbs up. And there are lots of gaming PC hardware videos on the way, so if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss my next video. I'm Roger with Life of Tech. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.